Did your parents believe in traditional discipline? My father believed boys became men through pain, and that comfort created weakness. When I was 7 years old and cried after falling off my bike, he made me sleep in the backyard shed for 3 nights to learn that tears were for women and children, not for males in our family. He called it traditional discipline, the way his grandfather raised him, the way real men were forged before the world went soft. Every punishment had that same justification attached like scripture. Dad ran our house like a military compound with rules posted on every wall written in his blocky handwriting. Wake at 0500 hours, beds made with hospital corners, bathroom cleaned after every use, chores completed before breakfast, inspections at 0700, 1200, and 1900 hours. My brothers Nathan and Dennis and I learned to move through the house silently, efficiently, like we were constantly being watched because we were. Dad would appear in doorways without warning, checking for dust on windowsills, wrinkles in bedsheets, dishes left in the sink. Every failure meant punishment, and punishments always involved physical labor designed to build character. The chore wheel in the kitchen listed our regular duties, but that was just baseline. Real discipline came through correction assignments when we messed up. Forgot to squeegee the shower, scrub every bathroom in the house with a toothbrush, left a jacket on the couch, reorganized the entire garage in under 2 hours, complained about dinner, make meals for the family for a week while everyone else ate what you cooked. Dad timed everything with his stopwatch, and if you didn't finish fast enough, you started over. I spent my 8th birthday reorganizing the tool shed 4 times because I kept missing his time requirement by minutes. Mom went along with everything Dad said because she believed wives submitted to husbands in all things. She'd grown up in the same church Dad attended, the one where Pastor Raymond preached about biblical manhood and wifely obedience every Sunday. When Nathan complained to her once about having to dig drainage ditches in the backyard as punishment for talking back, she told him that Dad knew best, and questioning him was questioning God's design for families. She never intervened, never softened punishments, just nodded along while Dad explained how this was preparing us for the real world where nobody cared about your feelings. The worst punishments involved what Dad called attitude adjustments. These happened when one of us showed weakness or emotion he deemed inappropriate for males. Dennis cried during a movie when he was 9, some scene where a dog died, and Dad made him watch it on repeat for 6 hours straight while standing at attention. Every time Dennis's eyes got wet, Dad added another viewing. By the end, Dennis just stared at the screen with no expression at all, and Dad nodded with satisfaction, saying, "That's what self-control looked like." Dennis stopped showing emotion after that. Even when our grandmother died 2 years later, he just stood at the funeral with that same blank expression. Nathan got attitude adjustments most frequently because he had this defiant streak that Dad wanted to break. When Nathan was 12, he questioned why we had to do push-ups as punishment for leaving lights on. Dad made him do push-ups for 3 hours straight in the driveway while neighbors walked past. Every time Nathan's form got sloppy, Dad reset the count to 0. Nathan's arms gave out after the first hour, and he collapsed face first onto the concrete. Dad told him to get up or stay there all night. Nathan got up. His arms shook so badly he could barely lift them for a week afterward, but Dad said that's what happened when you questioned authority. I learned early to keep my head down and follow orders exactly. I memorized Dad's inspection checklist and triple-checked everything before he arrived. I set alarms to finish tasks early. I practiced making beds until the corners could bounce quarters. My strategy was perfection through preparation, becoming invisible by being exactly what Dad wanted. It worked most of the time, but nobody could be perfect constantly. When I was 10, I forgot to take the trash to the curb on collection day. Dad woke me at midnight and made me take every bag of garbage from our house to the dump myself, walking the 3 miles there and back multiple times until everything was disposed of. 7 trips total over 5 hours, while Dad followed behind in his truck with the headlights on me the entire time. Church was mandatory every Sunday and Wednesday evening. Pastor Raymond's sermons focused heavily on masculine leadership and feminine submission, children honoring parents, sparing the rod, and spoiling the child. After services, Dad and other fathers would stand in the parking lot discussing discipline techniques like they were comparing workout routines. I remember overhearing Dad tell another man about making Nathan do push-ups, and the guy nodded appreciatively, saying his own son needed that kind of structure. Several families in our congregation ran their homes the same way, with military-style rules and labor-based punishments. It seemed normal within that community, like we were all part of some shared understanding about raising boys correctly. The summer I turned 13, Dad decided we were old enough for real work. He'd started a small construction cleanup business, and now we were his crew. Every day after school and all weekend, we'd load into his truck and head to job sites where we'd haul debris, clean up after contractors, sort materials for recycling. Dad didn't pay us because he said room and board was our compensation, plus we were learning valuable skills and work ethic. The labor was brutal, especially in summer heat, but complaining meant additional punishment work at home, so we learned to stay silent. Nathan was 15 by then, and his body couldn't keep up with the physical demands. He'd always been smaller and thinner than Dennis and me, built more for running than lifting, but Dad didn't accept that as an excuse. When Nathan struggled to carry a bundle of rebar that weighed nearly as much as he did, Dad made him run laps around the construction site with it until he could do it without stopping. Nathan vomited twice during those laps, but Dad just told him to clean it up and keep going. The construction workers on site looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. Dad was the contractor's cleanup guy, and what happened with his sons was family business. Dennis handled the work better physically, but it was destroying him mentally. He'd become this hollow version of himself, going through motions without any personality behind his eyes. He never smiled, never joked, never showed any emotion at all. At school, teachers commented on his flat affect, but when they called home, Dad told them Dennis was just mature and focused, unlike other boys his age who were distracted by foolishness. The school dropped it after that because Dad's explanations sounded reasonable, especially coming from a father who was active in church and ran his own business. One Saturday when I was 14, I dropped a box of tile that shattered across the construction site floor. Dad's face went red and he didn't yell, just pointed at his truck. On the drive home, he explained that clumsiness cost money and wasted time, so I needed to learn the value of careful handling through consequence. At home, he had me load and unload his entire truck bed 50 times, moving heavy equipment and materials from truck to driveway, while he sat on the porch watching. My hands developed blisters that popped and bled. When I finished 6 hours later, Dad inspected my raw palms and said, "Now, I'd remember to be more careful." Mom watched from the kitchen window during that punishment, and her face showed no expression at all. Later, she put antibacterial ointment and bandages on my hands without commenting on what caused the injuries. I asked her quietly if Dad's grandfather really raised him this way, if this was truly how men in our family were made. She paused for a second, then said, "Dad knew what he was doing, and we should trust his wisdom." Something about her hesitation felt off, but I was too tired and hurting to push further. The pattern continued through my freshman year of high school. School, work sites, punishments, church, repeat. My grades stayed decent because Dad demanded honor roll performance on top of everything else, though he never used academic achievement as his primary focus. Education was fine, but labor built character. I'd see other kids at school talking about sports teams, video games, hanging out at the mall, and their lives seemed impossibly foreign. I had exactly 0 free time and had learned to stop wanting things because wanting led to disappointment. Nathan started researching our family history that year for a school genealogy project. He spent weeks going through old documents Mom kept in the attic and talking to relatives on Dad's side. One evening, he came to Dennis and me looking confused and said he couldn't find any information about our great-grandfather's discipline methods that Dad always referenced. In fact, from what relatives told Nathan, great-grandfather had been described as gentle and permissive, someone who let his kids run wild. Nathan's hands shook while he showed us printouts of family interviews where multiple relatives said great-grandfather never believed in corporal punishment. We sat in Nathan's room after Dad went to bed and talked in whispers. Dennis suggested maybe Dad misremembered, or maybe there were family stories Nathan didn't have access to yet. But Nathan shook his head and said he'd talked to Dad's own sister, our aunt, who lived 3 states away, and she'd laughed when Nathan asked about their strict upbringing. She told Nathan that their father was loving and patient, never raised his voice, and she didn't know where Dad got his current parenting philosophy, because it definitely didn't come from their childhood home. I felt something shift in my chest, this strange mix of confusion and anger. If Dad's traditional discipline wasn't traditional at all, what did that mean? I started paying more attention after that to inconsistencies in Dad's stories. He'd reference his grandfather's methods, but the details changed depending on when he told them. Sometimes great-grandfather made him work construction as a boy. Other times it was farm labor. Once it was logging. The settings and specifics shifted, but the core message stayed the same, that boys became men through suffering and obedience. When I carefully asked Dad to tell me more about great-grandfather, trying to nail down concrete details, he got irritated and said questioning was disrespectful, that I should trust his lived experience instead of interrogating him like some kind of prosecutor. That summer, the work ramped up because Dad landed several large contracts. We were working 10-hour days in brutal heat, hauling materials, digging, lifting, cleaning. Nathan collapsed on site one afternoon, just went down hard onto the concrete. Dad threw water on him and told him to get up, that real men pushed through discomfort. Nathan tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. Dad grabbed him by the shirt and physically pulled him to his feet, holding him there while telling him that weakness was a choice. One of the construction workers finally stepped in and said the kid needed a hospital. Dad waved him off, saying Nathan just needed to toughen up, but the worker pulled out his phone and threatened to call 911 himself if Dad didn't take Nathan for medical attention. At the emergency room, they diagnosed Nathan with severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. The doctor asked pointed questions about how long Nathan had been working in the heat without adequate water breaks. Dad explained we were family working together, and sometimes young men needed to learn their limits. The doctor's expression shifted to something harder, and he stepped out to speak with someone. A hospital social worker came in next and asked to speak with Nathan privately. Dad refused, saying Nathan was a minor and he had the right to be present. The social worker insisted, and eventually Dad agreed, but positioned himself where Nathan could see him through the door window. I don't know what Nathan told the social worker, but afterward she gave Dad paperwork about child labor laws and said she was filing a report with the state. Dad smiled his public smile, the one he used with Pastor Raymond and church members, and thanked her for her concern while assuring her this was an isolated incident of poor judgment on his part. He shook her hand and promised Nathan wouldn't be working in those conditions again. On the drive home, Dad's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles went white, but he didn't say anything until we got back to the house. That night, Dad made Nathan stand in the backyard holding a 5-gallon bucket of water above his head while explaining that running to authorities about family matters was betrayal. Every time Nathan's arms dropped, Dad added more water to the bucket. Mom watched from the back door, and when I caught her eye, she looked away quickly. I wanted to tell Dad that Nathan hadn't run to anyone, that the social worker came on her own, but fear kept my mouth shut. Nathan held that bucket for 3 hours before Dad finally let him put it down. Nathan's shoulders were destroyed afterward, couldn't lift his arms above chest height for days. Dennis pulled me aside the next morning before work and said we needed to do something. His voice was quiet but urgent, the most emotion I'd heard from him in years. He said Dad was going to seriously hurt Nathan eventually, that the hospital social worker was right to file a report, and we needed to make sure something actually came from it. I asked what we could possibly do because Dad controlled everything in our lives. Dennis pulled out his phone and showed me a voice recording app he'd downloaded. He said he was going to start documenting what happened at home and at work sites. Evidence, he called it, just in case. I felt scared and relieved at the same time. Scared because if Dad found out, the consequences would be unimaginable. Relieved because finally someone was doing something instead of just enduring. I told Dennis I'd help however I could. Nathan joined us and said he wanted to help too. For the first time, we were united in something other than shared suffering. We made a plan. Dennis would record conversations when possible. I would photograph injuries with my phone camera. Nathan would document everything in writing, dates and times and exact descriptions. We'd keep everything backed up to a shared secret email account none of us accessed from home. The documentation started small. I took photos of bruises on Nathan's arms from Dad grabbing him. Dennis recorded Dad explaining during dinner why weakness was unacceptable in males. Nathan wrote detailed accounts of work hours, tasks performed, and punishments given. We were careful and paranoid, deleting any trace from our phones after uploading to the secret account. Every time Dad's footsteps approached while we were documenting, my heart would race so fast I thought he could hear it. A month after the hospital incident, someone from Child Protective Services came to our house. Dad had received the visit notice in advance and prepared us thoroughly. He explained that misguided people who didn't understand proper parenting sometimes interfered in family matters. He told us exactly what to say about our home life, how to describe his discipline as firm but fair, how to emphasize that we were well cared for and loved. Any deviation from his script would result in severe consequences for all of us. He didn't specify what those consequences would be, which made them more terrifying than if he'd listed them explicitly. The CPS worker, a tired-looking woman named Gloria Sheffield, arrived on Wednesday afternoon. She walked through our immaculately clean house while Dad explained his parenting philosophy, using words like structure, accountability, and preparing boys for manhood. He showed her the chore wheel and explained how regular responsibilities built work ethic. Everything he said sounded reasonable and thoughtful, like he'd pulled it from some parenting book about raising successful children. Gloria nodded along and took notes without much visible reaction. When she asked to speak with each of us individually, Dad smiled warmly and said, of course, he had nothing to hide. Nathan went first, and I could see him through the kitchen window, his face carefully blank while he answered her questions. Then Dennis, who maintained his usual flat affect. Then me. Gloria sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked general questions about school, chores, and discipline methods. I followed Dad's script carefully because I could feel him watching from the living room doorway. Did I feel safe at home? Yes. Did my father ever hurt me? Only appropriate discipline when I messed up. Did I have concerns about anything? No, ma'am. Everything was fine. Gloria looked at me for a long moment like she was trying to see beneath my careful answers. Then she asked what happened when I got in trouble. I described mild consequences, timeouts and extra chores, the sanitized version Dad had told us to present. She asked about Nathan's hospital visit and I explained it was an accident, poor judgment about hydration on a hot day, something Dad felt terrible about. She wrote everything down and thanked me for talking with her. Her expression gave nothing away. After Gloria left, Dad gathered us in the living room and said we'd done well. He was proud of our loyalty to family and our understanding that outsiders didn't need to know our private business. Then he explained that because of the investigation, we'd need to be more careful about visible evidence of discipline. Work would continue, but at reduced hours to comply with child labor restrictions. Home punishments would need to avoid leaving marks. He said this with no shame or acknowledgement that maybe his methods were the problem. Just strategic adjustment to avoid future interference. The next few months felt like holding our breath underwater. We continued documenting when we could. But opportunities were limited because Dad was hyper-aware of potential scrutiny. He stopped giving punishments that left visible injuries and instead focused on psychological techniques and labor that looked voluntary. Instead of making Nathan hold heavy objects for hours, he'd assign him projects with impossible time frames and then critique his failure. Instead of making me scrub things with toothbrushes, He'd have me reorganize storage areas repeatedly until I got it exactly right by his changing standards. Dennis's recording captured something significant one evening when Dad was talking to Mom in their bedroom. We'd hidden his phone behind books on a shelf during Dad's afternoon inspection routine. That night, Dad told Mom he was tired of walking on eggshells because some social worker didn't understand that boys needed firm guidance. He said his own father had been too soft, and look how Dad's brother turned out, divorced and unemployed, a complete failure. Dad said he'd promised himself his sons would be different, that he'd make them into men no matter what it took, using methods he'd researched and refined over years. Mom's quiet voice asked if he ever worried he was too harsh. Dad laughed and said harsh was relative, that everything he did was necessary because the world was harsh and unprepared boys became broken men. Nathan transcribed that recording word for word and saved it with a timestamp. The phrase methods he'd researched and refined stood out because it contradicted his constant references to family tradition. That night, we sat together in Dennis's room after everyone went to sleep and listened to the recording on low volume. Dennis said it proved Dad made everything up, that there was no traditional discipline passed down through generations, just Dad's personal theory about building men through suffering. Nathan added that if we could prove Dad fabricated the family history he always cited, it would expose his justifications as lies. I suggested we try to get Dad talking about his grandfather on recording, push for specific details we could verify against Nathan's genealogy research. The opportunity came during Sunday dinner a week later, when Mom asked Dad to share family stories with us boys so we'd appreciate our heritage. Dad started telling a story about great-grandfather teaching him construction work at age 8, making him carry materials and dig foundations. Dennis had his phone recording in his pocket and asked careful questions. What construction company did great-grandfather work for? Dad said it was private contracting. Where did they work? Various sites around the county? Can you remember specific projects? Dad's irritation showed when he said the details didn't matter. What mattered was the character-building experience. Nathan followed up by mentioning the genealogy project from last year, asking if Dad remembered great-grandfather's military service since Nathan had found discharge papers listing him as a clerk. Dad's face tightened, and he said Nathan must have looked at the wrong documents because great-grandfather was infantry, saw combat, came home tough as nails. Nathan quietly said the documents listed his occupation, and it was definitely administrative. Dad stood up from the table and told Nathan that questioning family history was disrespectful and showed a lack of gratitude for everything our ancestors sacrificed. Dinner ended abruptly, with Dad storming off to his office. Later, Nathan showed us the actual military records he'd requested months ago. Great-grandfather served in a non-combat role stateside, was honorably discharged after 2 years, and his file included commendations for his patience and supportive leadership style. Nothing about being tough as nails or combat experience. Combined with the recording of Dad contradicting documented facts, we had proof he was fabricating the family tradition narrative. The question was, what to do with it. Dennis suggested we send everything to Gloria Sheffield at CPS. Nathan worried it wouldn't be enough since we'd already told her everything was fine. I pointed out that we'd lied during her visit because we were scared, and now we had evidence of why. We spent that night going through our documentation. Dozens of recordings capturing Dad explaining his philosophy, giving punishments, threatening consequences. Hundreds of photos showing injuries at various stages of healing. Nathan's detailed written timeline spanning 18 months. Family documents proving Dad's traditional discipline story was fabricated. The next morning before school, I created a new email from a library computer and sent everything to Gloria Sheffield with a detailed explanation. We'd lied during her visit because we feared retaliation. This evidence showed the reality of our home life, the fabricated family history Dad used to justify his methods, the injuries, the excessive labor, the psychological manipulation. I hit send before I could second-guess myself and cleared the browser history. At school, I couldn't focus on anything, just kept wondering what would happen next. 3 days passed with no response, and I started thinking maybe Gloria hadn't received it or didn't care. Then on Monday afternoon, 2 CPS investigators showed up at our house without warning. Dad wasn't home, out on a job site, and Mom let them in with a confused expression. They explained they had questions about allegations and needed to inspect the house and speak with us boys immediately. One investigator was Gloria. The other was an older man named Kenneth Pratt, who looked like he'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by much. They separated us into different rooms this time. Kenneth took me into the den and closed the door. His first question was direct and startling. "Did you send the documentation package?" I hesitated because Dad had programmed us to lie to authorities, but Kenneth's expression was patient and knowing. He said I wasn't in trouble for documenting, that it was actually brave and smart. He said they'd reviewed everything and had serious concerns, so I stopped following Dad's script and told the truth. Everything. The punishments, the labor violations, the heat exhaustion incident, Dad's fabricated family history, the threats if we talked. Kenneth listened without interrupting and took detailed notes. When Dad got home an hour later, he walked into the house and saw CPS investigators talking to his sons. His public smile appeared instantly, and he asked how he could help them. Kenneth explained they were conducting a follow-up investigation based on new information. Dad's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes went cold. He said we were a private family dealing with normal parenting challenges, and he'd appreciate if the state stopped harassing them based on misunderstandings. Gloria pulled out printed screenshots from our documentation package and started asking Dad very specific questions. Can you explain this recording where you describe your discipline methods? Can you explain these photos of injuries? Can you explain why you told us your grandfather raised you with traditional strict discipline when military records and family members contradict that? Dad's mask cracked just slightly. He said those recordings were taken without his knowledge and probably edited. The injuries were from normal boyhood activities and work accidents. His family history was personal, and he didn't need to justify it to strangers. Kenneth interrupted and said actually, using fabricated family traditions to justify abusive punishment was something they took very seriously. He said the labor violations alone warranted investigation, but combined with documented physical and psychological abuse, they were implementing an emergency safety plan. Dad's control shattered completely. He started yelling about parental rights and government overreach and how he was raising his sons to be men in a world full of weak, entitled children. He said we were his kids, and he'd discipline us however he saw fit. Gloria stood up and calmly explained that children were not property, and Dad's methods constituted abuse, regardless of his philosophical justifications. Kenneth added that they had evidence of labor law violations, that Dad had been using his minor children as unpaid workers in his business, which was illegal outside very specific family business exceptions. A sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later because Dad refused to calm down. Mom sat on the couch crying while Dad paced and ranted about traditional values and masculine development being under attack. Kenneth explained to all of us that Nathan, Dennis, and I would be placed in temporary protective custody while they completed their investigation. Dad could contest the removal in court, but for now, the evidence warranted immediate intervention. I felt this surreal mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally stopping Dad. Terror about what came next. We were allowed to pack bags with clothes and essentials. I grabbed my phone and charger and some schoolwork, moving mechanically through the motions. Dennis packed in silence with his usual flat expression, but his hands trembled slightly. Nathan looked shell-shocked, like he couldn't process what was happening. Mom stood in the hallway crying and saying she didn't understand why this was necessary, that Dad only wanted what was best for us. Kenneth gently told her that abusive control wasn't love, regardless of intention. They separated us into different foster placements initially, because they didn't have one home that could take 3 teenage boys immediately. I went with a couple named Gary and Beth Norman, who'd fostered dozens of kids over 20 years. Their house was quiet and comfortable with no military inspection charts on the walls. Beth showed me my room and explained basic house rules that seemed shockingly normal. Dinner at 6, homework before TV, bedtime on school nights at 10. Chores were minimal and rotated weekly. She asked if I had dietary restrictions or preferences, and I almost laughed because Dad never cared about our preferences for anything. That first night, I couldn't sleep in the comfortable bed with its soft pillows. I kept waiting for someone to burst in and drag me outside for midnight punishment. I kept listening for Dad's truck in the driveway. Around 2 in the morning, I finally fell asleep and woke up screaming from a nightmare about Dad making me dig holes forever. Gary knocked quietly and asked if I was okay. I said yes automatically before remembering I didn't have to lie anymore. I told him I had nightmares about my father, and he nodded understandingly, said that was completely normal after leaving an abusive situation. School felt strange the next day because everyone knew something happened. Small-town gossip traveled fast, and apparently multiple people had seen CPS vehicles at our house. People stared but didn't ask directly. My teachers had been notified about my change in living situation and gave me sympathetic looks that made me uncomfortable. I just wanted everything to feel normal, but nothing did anymore. During lunch, I got a call from Nathan, who was in a different foster home across town. He sounded lost and asked if I thought we did the right thing. I said yes, even though I wasn't entirely sure. We'd destroyed our family to escape Dad's control. That felt both necessary and devastating. The court hearing happened 3 weeks later. Dad had hired a lawyer who argued that traditional discipline and strong work ethic shouldn't be criminalized just because modern society had gone soft. The lawyer presented Dad as a devoted father, preparing his sons for harsh reality, fighting against a nanny state that wanted to bubble-wrap children. Dad took the stand and gave an impassioned speech about his parenting philosophy, his concern about raising boys who could handle adversity, his belief that structure and labor built character. Then the state's attorney presented our evidence, recordings of Dad threatening us, describing his methods, contradicting his own stories, photos of injuries in various stages of healing, Nathan's detailed timeline of punishments and work hours, expert testimony about child labor laws and the physical dangers we'd been exposed to, a genealogist's analysis of Dad's family history claims compared to actual records showing systematic fabrication, testimony from the construction worker who'd witnessed Nathan collapse, the hospital social worker's report. It was overwhelming and damning. The judge listened to everything over 2 days of testimony. Dad's lawyer tried to argue that boys throughout history worked alongside fathers, and tough love was a valid parenting approach. The state countered that there was legal definition of abuse regardless of parental philosophy, that work hours exceeded legal limits for minors, that fabricating family history to justify psychological manipulation was abusive by any standard. When the judge finally ruled, she explained in careful legal language that parental rights didn't extend to abuse, that children deserved protection from harm even when parents believed they were acting in their children's best interest. Dad lost custody pending completion of psychological evaluation and parenting courses. We would remain in foster care for at least 6 months, while he worked with supervised counseling and proved he could parent without abusive methods. Mom could have supervised visitation since she'd never directly harmed us, but she declined, saying if the state thought she couldn't parent, then she wouldn't participate in their system. The judge's expression showed disappointment at Mom's choice, but didn't force the issue. I stayed with Gary and Beth Norman for 8 months. They taught me that normal families didn't require perfection, that mistakes were learning opportunities, that boys could express emotion without being weak. Beth taught me to cook actual recipes instead of just following Dad's efficiency-based meal plans. Gary helped me with homework without making it a test of character. Slowly, I started remembering what it felt like to be a regular teenager. Dennis ended up with a family that specialized in kids with attachment issues. His foster parents were patient and gave him space to process at his own pace. I talked to him weekly, and gradually his flat affect started cracking. Small expressions would slip through, tiny moments of actual emotion. He told me his therapist was helping him understand that shutting down had been survival strategy, but he didn't need to survive anymore. He could actually live. Nathan's placement was with a family active in a different church, one that preached about God's love instead of fear-based obedience. He started questioning everything Dad taught us about faith and masculinity and what men were supposed to be. His foster parents encouraged the questions instead of punishing them. Nathan told me once on the phone that he was learning he didn't have to earn basic human dignity through suffering, that he'd always been worthy of kindness just for existing. The three of us met for supervised visits once a week at a family center. A social worker sat nearby while we talked and slowly rebuilt our relationships outside Dad's control structure. We weren't just suffering brothers anymore. We were actually brothers with personalities and opinions and different ways of processing what happened. Nathan wanted to forgive Dad eventually. Dennis wasn't sure he could. I was somewhere in the middle, angry, but also sad about what our family could have been. Dad completed his psychological evaluation, and the results weren't good. The psychologist's report described narcissistic tendencies, rigid thinking, inability to accept responsibility for harm caused, and deep-seated beliefs about masculine development that bordered on obsessive. The recommended treatment plan was extensive. Years of therapy to address core issues. Dad refused to participate meaningfully, showing up to mandated sessions but not engaging with the process. His position remained that the state was wrong and his parenting was right. Mom filed for divorce 8 months after we were removed. She told the mediator she couldn't reconcile her belief in supporting her husband with the evidence of harm to her children. She'd spent months in her own therapy working through how she'd enabled Dad's abuse by staying silent, and she wanted supervised visitation with us if we were willing. Nathan agreed immediately, desperate for any parent relationship. Dennis took longer to decide, but eventually said yes. I struggled with it because Mom's silence had hurt almost as much as Dad's actions. But her lawyer provided copies of her therapy records, showing genuine effort to understand and change. I agreed to try. Our first visit with Mom was awkward and painful. She cried and apologized and said she'd failed us by not protecting us from Dad. She explained that she'd been raised to believe questioning husbands was sinful, and Dad's confidence had convinced her he knew best. None of that excused her choices, but she wanted us to know she understood her role in our suffering. Nathan hugged her. Dennis kept his distance. I sat somewhere in between, wanting to forgive but not quite there yet. Dad never admitted wrongdoing. His supervised visits, the few times we agreed to see him, consisted of lectures about how we'd betrayed family loyalty, and someday we'd understand he'd been preparing us for real life. He still believed his methods were correct, and we were too young and corrupted by weak modern thinking to appreciate them. After 3 miserable visits, all 3 of us decided to stop seeing him. The supervisors said that was our right, and Dad couldn't force contact. The labor investigation resulted in fines and business penalties for Dad. The state found he'd violated multiple child labor statutes by having us work excessive hours in hazardous conditions without proper compensation or safety measures. His business license was suspended pending compliance with regulations. He blamed us for destroying his livelihood, sent angry letters through his lawyer about ungrateful sons ruining everything he'd built. His lack of accountability only reinforced that we'd made the right choice. Gary and Beth eventually asked if I wanted to stay with them long-term instead of going back to Mom's house. They'd grown attached, and I had too. I asked what Dennis and Nathan thought, and Dennis said his foster family had made the same offer. Nathan wanted to try living with Mom again, believing she'd genuinely changed. We talked about it together and decided we didn't need to make the same choices, that we could have different relationships with our parents without betraying each other. So I stayed with Gary and Beth officially through guardianship transfer. Dennis stayed with his family. Nathan moved in with Mom. 2 years later, I'm 17 and applying to colleges. Gary and Beth support whatever path I choose without pressure or expectations tied to their approval. I still have nightmares sometimes about Dad's punishments. Still flinch when I mess something up expecting consequences. My therapist says trauma recovery isn't linear, and that's okay. I'm learning to be imperfect without panic, to pursue things because I enjoy them, instead of to avoid punishment. Dennis graduated early and started technical school for computer programming. His emails are longer now, more personal, and he uses emojis sometimes, which seems like a miracle given where he started. Nathan texts me photos from his new church's youth group activities. Looks genuinely happy in ways I never saw at home. Mom sends occasional messages asking how I'm doing, respecting my boundaries about contact frequency. Dad sent one letter on my 17th birthday saying he hoped I'd come to my senses someday. I didn't respond. Last month, the court finalized that Dad's custody rights were permanently terminated based on his refusal to complete treatment and continued denial of wrongdoing. He could petition for contact when we turned 18, but couldn't force it. The judge's final statement said that traditional discipline meant teaching and guiding children, not breaking their spirits through fear and fabricated justifications. She hoped Dad would eventually understand the difference. But in the meantime, she was protecting 3 boys who deserved better than what he'd provided. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.